history often has a flair for the dramatic. General Douglas MacArthur seems to come straight out of a storybook, a larger-than-life figure wrapped in legend, heroism, and a fair share of controversy. A man of towering ego and unwavering resolve, MacArthur lived as if the world were his battlefield, leaving behind tales that often read more like epic fiction than historical record. From his early days as a young soldier surviving jungle ambushes in the Philippines, to his rise as the general who led Allied forces in the Pacific, his life was defined by audacity, brilliance, and a consistent tendency to challenge the rules. Born into a military family in 1880 on a frontier army post in Arkansas, MacArthur's destiny was shaped by the clash of cultures and the discipline of a soldier's life. He claimed to have learned to ride and shoot before he could read or write, a boast fitting for someone whose career would span 52 years of military service. His ascent began at West Point, where he graduated at the top of his class and continued through World War I, where he earned a reputation as a fearless leader. MacArthur didn't command from the rear. He led trench raids and scouting missions himself, collecting a staggering number of medals for valor under fire. Yet MacArthur's achievements were often matched by his excesses. He was the kind of leader who could inspire deep loyalty and sharp criticism in equal measure. His signature aviator sunglasses, corncob pipe, and dramatic speeches turned him into a symbol, but also reinforced his image as someone who didn't just follow the beat of his own drum, but composed the entire score. In the interwar years, MacArthur took on roles ranging from Olympic Committee leadership to reorganizing the Filipino military, all with his trademark mix of determination and showmanship. But it was during World War II that his legend truly peaked. As Japanese forces swept through the Pacific, MacArthur led a determined defense of the Philippines, rallying troops on the blood-soaked beaches of Bataan. Forced to evacuate under direct orders, he left behind a besieged army and a humbled command, but not a defeated spirit. His vow to return became a rallying cry for a relentless campaign that would reshape the Pacific theater. MacArthur's story is one of extremes. A man revered as a hero and reviled as an egotist. A brilliant strategist who sometimes overreached. A commanding figure whose presence loomed as large as the battles he fought. His journey from the jungles of the Philippines to the halls of power is not just the story of a soldier. It's the saga of a man determined to be unforgettable. In the Philippines, his legacy remains deeply woven into national memory, remembered more for his wartime heroics than for the costly missteps that came with them. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the relationship between the United States and its first colony, the Philippines. Episode number 4, MacArthur's Mission. Prior to World War II, the United States, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, agreed to grant the Philippines its long-sought independence within a decade. The planned date for the celebration was July 4th, 1946, a date as Filipino as the apple pie they learned about in their American-run compulsory schools. But the Japanese had a different set of fireworks planned for the island chain. With war looming on the horizon, the quasi-president of the quasi-independent colony turned to a familiar figure, American Commander Douglas MacArthur. The future hero of World War II had already had a number of flirtatious stays in the archipelago. He spent part of his teenage years there, stationed alongside his father, Arthur MacArthur, who served as military governor. After leaving to attend West Point, where he graduated at the top of the class in 1903, MacArthur quickly began collecting accolades, earning comparisons to Robert E. Lee, who had graduated from the Academy 74 years earlier. We won't go too deep into his personal life, but two details from this period stand out. First was his comfort with, if not expectation of, accolades. MacArthur wasn't the type to shrink from praise. He was the kind of man who might write his own introduction just to ensure the entrance sounded right. Second, and perhaps related to the first, was his unusually close relationship with his mother. Pinky, as she was known, moved into a nearby hotel during his 4 years at West Point and remained a constant presence in his life, even involving herself in his romantic prospects. His first wife later suggested that the general was still a virgin at the age of 42 due to his mother's overbearing influence. MacArthur returned to the Philippines after graduation, where, despite his father's lofty title, he was treated like any other young officer. But to him, the islands represented a land of opportunity. Unlike many Americans of the era, he didn't seem to carry a superiority complex towards the colony. He socialized with locals and formed friendships, even though his time there wasn't without hardship. In one instance, he was ambushed by 2 native guerrillas and was forced to shoot in self-defense. After confirming they were no longer a threat, he reached up and discovered a bullet hole clean through his campaign hat. He eventually had to leave the islands after contracting malaria, but once recovered, he was assigned to accompany his father on a diplomatic tour across Asia. That journey left a lasting impression. MacArthur would later write that it was the most important experience of his life, convincing him that his future, and indeed the very existence of America, were irrevocably entwined with Asia and its island outposts. A decade and a half later, MacArthur was making a name for himself on the battlefields of France. He forged his own path, famously telling comrades, "It's the orders you disobey that make you famous." As a colonel, he stood out, not just for his rank, but because the only weapon he carried was a swagger stick, even though he was almost always near the action. In one daring episode, he crawled across no man's land to cut barbed wire ahead of an assault. His French allies, thinking him surely lost, were stunned when he reappeared through the smoke, herding a group of prisoners ahead of him with that same swagger stick. They nicknamed him D'Artagnan, and the French awarded him the Croix de Guerre, making him the first American soldier in France to receive the prestigious honor. MacArthur's flair for bold, independent action didn't sit well with some of his superiors, but 2 powerful allies helped keep his career on track. The first was an Ohio congressman whom MacArthur had taken to the front lines, against direct orders. That politician began building the legend of Douglas MacArthur, telling the press that he was the greatest fighting frontline general in the U.S. Army. The second ally was his ever-devoted mother, who launched a relentless letter-writing campaign to military leadership, pressing them to promote her more than deserving son. When the war ended, MacArthur was appointed superintendent of West Point. The hope was that he could bring modern thinking to a traditionally rigid institution. Under his leadership, the curriculum expanded to include subjects like history, government, economics, and psychology. Physical fitness also became a major focus. The athletic competitions grew so intense that cadets dubbed intramurals intra-murder. Above the gymnasium, MacArthur installed a quote that endures to this day. "Upon the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds of future victories and future peace." But reform didn't come easy. The entrenched faculty resisted his changes with more success than the Germans had in France. After fewer than 3 years, MacArthur was pushed out. During this time, MacArthur fell in love and quickly proposed to wealthy, high society divorcee Louise Cromwell Brooks the night they met. After a whirlwind wedding, the couple relocated to the Philippines for MacArthur's second assignment there. The islands, however, didn't suit Brooks' opulent lifestyle, and the marriage eventually dissolved. With his personal life in disarray, MacArthur immersed himself in his work, taking command of a lean U.S. infantry brigade, 11,000 Americans, and 6,000 Filipino auxiliaries. Their reduced numbers were the result of a mutual disarmament agreement with Japan, intended to ease tensions and avoid war in the Pacific. Japan, though largely uninvolved in World War I, had emerged from the Treaty of Versailles with outsized territorial gains, particularly Germany's former Pacific islands. This victory whetted Japan's appetite for empire, spurred on by Alfred Thayer Mahan's influential book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Ironically, that same book had inspired the U.S. to push into Cuba and the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. Another concern for MacArthur during this period was how to defend the Philippines in case of Japanese aggression. Historically, Manila Bay had fallen quickly to every foreign power that had attacked it. The geography made it almost impossible to defend. There were simply too many potential landing sites. Dwight Eisenhower, serving as MacArthur's primary aide, rightly noted that amphibious assaults were the most difficult operations in modern warfare. But the Philippines' 22,000 miles of coastline presented a nightmare scenario. 17,000 troops simply couldn't cover it all. Aircraft might have helped, but like many commanders of his era, MacArthur still favored manpower over air power. With his marriage failing, MacArthur returned to Washington, receiving yet another promotion, once again thanks to his mother's persistent lobbying. He was named the youngest major general in the U.S. Army. But the Washington posting left him disillusioned, and he returned to the Philippines. Now nearly 50 and unmarried, MacArthur began a relationship with rising Filipina film star Isabel Rosario Cooper, better known by her stage name, Dimples. At the time, interracial cohabitation was tolerated in a way interracial marriage was not. MacArthur's arrangement was quietly accepted, so long as it remained unofficial. When President Herbert Hoover called him back to Washington, MacArthur brought Dimples along, but tried to hide the relationship from his ever-watchful mother. In 1932, he made headlines for the wrong reasons. He mobilized 800 active-duty soldiers to disperse a group of unarmed World War I veterans who had gathered in Washington to demand promised bonus payments. These men, many of them destitute due to the Great Depression, were violently driven out of their camps. Eisenhower later recalled warning MacArthur, "That dumb son of a bitch should have stayed out of it." But MacArthur, always casting himself as the central character, dramatically declared, "MacArthur has decided to go into active command in the field. There is incipient revolution in the air." Historian Stanley Carnow describes the event starkly, writing that he pursued them with bayonets and tear gas across the Anacostia River southeast of the capital. There, as women and children fled in terror, his men burned their encampment of shacks and tents. Eisenhower, deeply disturbed, remarked, "I just can't understand how such a damn fool could have gotten to be a general." The incident was front-page news across the country. Democratic presidential candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared that, next to demagogue Huey Lewis, Douglas MacArthur was the most dangerous man in America. Seeking to repair his image, MacArthur sued several newspapers for libel. In defending themselves, reporters uncovered evidence of his secret relationship with Dimples. Faced with the threat of public exposure, MacArthur dropped the lawsuits, paid Cooper's $15,000 for her collection of love letters, and offered an equal amount to cover the legal fees of those he had sued. The total, about 3 years of his salary, was a costly retreat. He remained with the Joint Chiefs through the early days of Roosevelt's presidency, but frequently clashed with the new administration. One argument grew so heated that MacArthur vomited on the White House steps after Roosevelt rejected his resignation. Fed up with Washington, he once again looked to the Philippines as his refuge. War game simulations had concluded that the Philippines were utterly indefensible. MacArthur's command was justified not by its strategic strength, but as a kind of deterrent, a human shield meant to dissuade Japanese aggression. The hope was that Japan would consider American casualties too high a risk, as such losses would almost certainly provoke full-scale war with the United States. But Japan found itself in a strategic bind that left American military planners puzzled. In July 1937, Japan launched an invasion of China, igniting the Second Sino-Japanese War against both Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces and the communists under Mao Zedong. A year later, the war had devolved into a brutal stalemate, with Chinese guerrillas retaliating for Japanese atrocities, like the infamous Rape of Nanking. To break the deadlock, Japan needed access to vital resources: oil, rubber, tin, all of which were found in the Asiatic islands of the Pacific. Those territories, however, were controlled by colonial powers: Britain, France, the Netherlands, and most significantly, the United States. This put Japan on a direct collision course with America. When MacArthur returned to the Philippines, it was in a quasi-governmental role as military advisor to Filipino President Manuel Quezon. He secured the job by being the lone voice in Washington, insisting that the Philippines could be defended against a Japanese invasion. To sell his strategy, MacArthur compared the archipelago of 7,641 tropical islands to Switzerland, a snow-covered landlocked nation. The analogy baffled most in Washington, but it seemed to reassure Quezon, who personally matched the U.S. governor's salary to secure MacArthur's services. President Roosevelt, eager to be rid of his combative general, approved the arrangement, allowing MacArthur to retain his U.S. military ties while technically working under the Filipino government. Quezon was not known for sound decision-making. He famously repealed daylight savings time just weeks after implementing it, reportedly because he stubbed his toe in the early morning darkness. Yet he trusted MacArthur's vision. As historian Stanley Carnow recounts, MacArthur proposed a defense built on 11,000 Filipino regulars who would train a reserve force of 400,000 men, ready to be mobilized at the outbreak of war. They would defend the beaches in small mobile units supported by 50 patrol boats and 200 aircraft. If overrun, they would retreat and continue resistance from the interior to the furthest most retreat left available, as MacArthur put it. He estimated it would take 500,000 invading troops, $10 billion, and 3 years to conquer the Philippines, far more than any rational adversary would be willing to commit. His own plan, in contrast, would cost just $8 million a year over the next decade. Elihu Root, the former Secretary of State who had helped initiate America's colonial presence in the Philippines, saw things differently. Just before his death in 1937 at the age of 92, Root predicted that Japan could capture the islands within a week, forcing the United States to spend 5 years and $25 billion to take them back. In the years that followed, MacArthur found himself putting down a series of small, chaotic uprisings across the islands. The Great Depression had devastated the Pacific, undoing many of the gains made during American occupation. Life expectancy had soared thanks to public health improvements, but the feudal land system was not equipped to handle a booming population. Land holdings were split into ever smaller plots to satisfy inheritance claims, leaving farms too inefficient to sustain families. Aging parents clung to their tiny fields, while hunger forced them to pull children out of school to put them to work. Malnutrition made the population vulnerable once again to diseases that had once been nearly eradicated. One would-be revolutionary was a fishmonger who declared himself Emperor of the Philippines from a rattan throne on his front porch. He urged his followers to kill the rich with whatever weapons they could find. Despite the disorder and desperation, MacArthur kept sending optimistic reports to Washington, hoping to keep American weapons flowing into the islands. He understood what one candid assessment might mean: a total withdrawal. That was exactly what War Plan Orange, the Army's official Pacific strategy, called for in the event of a full-scale Japanese invasion. By late 1939, Dwight Eisenhower had had enough. He left MacArthur's service, saying, "I can't afford to go on teaching schoolboys any longer." The feeling was mutual. MacArthur offered only a backhanded compliment. He was the best clerk I ever had. Eisenhower, of course, would go on to command the D-Day invasion and help liberate Europe from Hitler's grasp. But he remained dismissive of his former boss, later quipping that the only thing he learned from MacArthur during their 7 years together was dramatics. The trajectory of the coming war was foreshadowed on September 1st, 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, igniting World War II. As Europe plunged into conflict, Philippine President Manuel Quezon began quietly reaching out to Japan, first through unofficial channels and later through an official visit, all in hopes of avoiding entanglement. But Japan's mess in China made that all but impossible. While the Philippines lacked the natural resources Japan desperately needed, its geography made it an ideal staging ground for American forces. That fact alone guaranteed Japanese interest. In a final desperate bid to keep the Philippines neutral, Quezon appealed directly to President Roosevelt. He asked that independence be granted ahead of schedule, allowing the Philippines to declare neutrality like Ireland and Switzerland had. But Roosevelt, perhaps using Quezon's plea as leverage to press Congress into action, refused the request outright. America's failure to recognize the seriousness of Japan's threat to the Philippines would prove costly. Part of this blind spot stemmed from implicit racial prejudices, an assumption that the Japanese could not possibly pose a serious military threat to the West. Yet Japan had been methodically preparing for war. As early as 1935, the Imperial Navy had begun construction on 2 super battleships, larger than anything in the U.S. fleet, which was constrained by the size of the Panama Canal. These ships were supported by the Mitsubishi Zero, a lightweight fighter that was unmatched at the war's outset. As the U.S. Naval Institute later observed, when the war began, the Zero was unquestionably the best performing fighter aircraft in the Pacific area. In the hands of seasoned Japanese pilots, the Zero would maintain superiority until the arrival of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat in mid-1943. Hitler's growing aggression in Europe meant that Britain, France, and the Netherlands were in no position to defend their colonies in Southeast Asia. Japan capitalized on this, signing a formal alliance with Nazi Germany and a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, ensuring that neither Stalin nor the Western Allies could easily intervene. Though Japanese aircraft had been spotted conducting reconnaissance over the Philippines in late 1940, Washington continued to pursue a diplomatic approach. Roosevelt instructed his envoys to adopt a firm but conciliatory tone, hoping to preserve peace even as tensions mounted. That hope unraveled in June 1941, when Hitler stunned the world by launching Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Japan, despite its alliance with Germany, chose not to support the invasion. Instead, their non-aggression pact with the Soviets freed up Stalin to shift forces eastward, reviving the dormant Russo-Japanese rivalry that had erupted in 1905. But rather than reassessing their strategic position, Japan pressed forward, launching a rapid military expansion across Southeast Asia on July 21, 1941. Their targets, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. The United States responded by freezing Japanese assets and severing trade, effectively cutting off Japan's access to American oil, on which they were almost entirely dependent. At the time, Japanese had just an 18-month oil reserve. War at that point became not just likely, but inevitable. With conflict in the Pacific now a certainty, Roosevelt moved to bolster MacArthur's defenses in the Philippines. He promised modern rifles, anti-aircraft guns, and most importantly, a fleet of 300 B-17 bombers capable of intercepting and sinking a Japanese invasion fleet before it reached shore. MacArthur's unrelenting optimism and assurances that the islands were defensible only reinforced Washington's confidence. That optimism was echoed in the American press. One Associated Press article smugly declared, "When the Japs come down here, they'll be playing in the big leagues for the first time in their lives." But reality was about to outpace rhetoric. On November 7, 1941, American intelligence began intercepting signs that Japan was preparing a military strike. By December 5th, Japanese diplomats were packing their bags and abandoning Washington. Then, on the morning of December 7, 1941, 350 Japanese Zeros launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack came in 3 waves and devastated much of the Pacific Fleet. But in a twist of fate, the most vital ships, the aircraft carriers, were not in port. They had been dispatched just days earlier on a top-secret training exercise. Although America had already been inching towards war, Pearl Harbor was the final blow. The attack shocked the public, silenced the isolationists, and gave Roosevelt the support he needed. With Congress now fully behind him, the United States officially entered World War II. American history textbooks often follow a familiar script when teaching World War II. First comes Pearl Harbor, the day that will live in infamy, followed by the U.S. declaration of war on Japan, and then shortly after, Germany's declaration of war on the United States. From there, classroom narratives typically pivot towards the European theater, the Atlantic Wall, D-Day, and the race to Berlin. Only after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, do students finally turn to the Pacific Theater, where they are introduced to the rise of the U.S. Marines, the Battle of Midway, and the atomic bombings that ended the war. But the war in the Pacific had raged on for 3.5 long years before Berlin fell, with much of the action centered around the Philippines. In fact, the island chain was struck by its own wave of Japanese Zeros just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor. The result was an even more catastrophic blow to Allied power in the Pacific. Nearly the entire Air Force of the Philippines was wiped out on the ground in a single swift attack. There were 4 major reasons for this failure, the first being General Douglas MacArthur himself. Like Hitler on D-Day, the 61-year-old general chose to sleep in on the morning of the most important day of his military career. Though he was woken up at 3 a.m. with the news of the Pearl Harbor attack, MacArthur returned to bed, rising again only 40 minutes later. His sluggish response continued throughout the morning. When the U.S. Navy proposed a preemptive airstrike on Japanese forces in Taiwan, the request was delayed for 7 hours. First by MacArthur's indecision, and then by the bottleneck at his chief of staff's desk. By the time approval came, it was too late. Compounding the problem was MacArthur's long-standing underestimation of air power, a blind spot that now proved disastrous. The second reason lay in Washington's failure to deliver on its promises. Instead of the pledged 300 B-17 bombers, only 35 had arrived in the Philippines. Still, that small force represented the largest concentration of long-range bombers outside the continental U.S., and every single one was destroyed before ever leaving the ground. That leads to the third reason, a cascade of logistical and communication failures. Radar equipment had failed to arrive, leaving the islands reliant on outdated human watch systems, spotters with binoculars and telescopes. When the Japanese strike force was finally seen, the call to the watchtower at Clark Field went unanswered. The radio operator, along with many of the pilots and ground crew, were away on a lunch break. The attack had coincided with a holy day in the Catholic Philippines, a national day of leisure. The fourth and final reason was sheer complacency, one best captured by historian Stanley Carnow. As he explains, they, the Japanese, could have bypassed the Philippines, which possessed none of the raw materials crucial to their forces, and avoided a clash with the Americans there as well. But by then, their military machine was being propelled by its own momentum. The Japanese assault on the Philippines mirrored the surprise at Pearl Harbor, but in many ways it was even more successful. Japanese aircraft reached Manila within minutes of the attack on Hawaii, targeting the U.S. naval station at Cavite. Yet MacArthur did virtually nothing for 9 hours after receiving word of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, assuming the Americans would launch a counterattack or at least scramble their planes in defense, approached cautiously. But as they neared Clark Field at 12:15 p.m., they were stunned to find all of America's air power parked neatly on the tarmac. 36 P-40 fighters and 17 B-17 flying fortresses, wings tip to tip, completely exposed. 40 miles west at Iba Field, another 16 P-40 sat grounded. One officer in Manila shouted a warning over the phone to a lieutenant at the base, who apparently forgot to pass the message along. The lone radar technician at Iba detected incoming aircraft and tried to warn Clark Field. He never got through. He was killed moments later as more than 100 Japanese planes screamed overhead and annihilated the base. Karnow continues. Waves of Mitsubishi bombers arrived above the range of the old U.S. anti-aircraft weapons, setting oil dumps ablaze, obliterating buildings, and gutting the runway. Pilots and mechanics dashed out in a futile effort to get their planes into the air. An eerie lull suddenly followed, and dazed survivors rose slowly from slit trenches, stumbling past corpses, too shaken to attend to the wounded. Then came the Zeros, and, unopposed, they machine-gunned the base for more than an hour. The Philippines had been caught utterly unprepared. Within a single afternoon, America's strongest overseas air presence was wiped out. The war in the Pacific had truly begun, and for the men stationed on those islands, the worst was yet to come. MacArthur downplayed the catastrophe in the Philippines in his dispatches to Washington, framing the situation as if his forces were still capable of taking the fight to the enemy. Many of his reports were not only exaggerated, but outright fabrications. One Life magazine reporter attempting to verify a story about a dramatic battlefield victory drove 100 miles only to find Filipino soldiers lounging peacefully on a deserted beach, where hundreds of Japanese corpses were supposedly strewn about. After seizing air superiority, the Japanese landed 43,000 troops on December 22nd, aiming to conquer the entire archipelago in just 7 weeks. MacArthur claimed to have them right where he wanted, but despite sometimes having numerical superiority, his troops were poorly equipped and largely untrained. He was ultimately forced to rely on the dreaded War Plan Orange, a defensive strategy that called for retreating inland and relying on guerrilla tactics to reclaim ground later. The plan designated 2 key defensive positions, Courageur and Bhutan. But MacArthur, confident he could prevent any enemy landings, had dispersed his limited supplies of food and water throughout the islands rather than stockpiling them at those fallback locations. When the Japanese forces did reach the shore, the defenders were left critically underprepared. According to Karnow, MacArthur finally rose to meet the moment. He declared Manila an open city, as Paris had been, to spare its population. Then he prepared for the most difficult of all military maneuvers: retreat. The task involved converging 2 separate armies, 80,000 men in total, spread more than 150 miles apart on northern and southern Luzon. They had to be funneled into the Bhutan Peninsula through a narrow corridor, a move that demanded precise coordination and perfect timing. MacArthur knew Bhutan well from his early days as an engineer. Its rugged, mountainous terrain made it ideal for a defensive stand, if it was properly supplied. The plan, meant to be completed in 2 weeks, required bridges to be blown at the right moment, roads to be secured, and scattered units to be regrouped quickly. Supplies had to be shipped to the peninsula with haste. Perhaps most challenging of all, inexperienced and frightened Filipino conscripts had to be led into battle by American officers who were often just as green and just as scared. Once consolidated, the troops faced a brutal new challenge: survival. They were crammed into makeshift encampments with minimal shelter and dwindling supplies. With food running out, soldiers resorted to hunting any animals they could find in the jungle. Disease, malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery spread rapidly throughout the ranks, thinning their numbers even faster than enemy fire. From his perch on Corridor, MacArthur urged the men of Bhutan to hold on until reinforcements could arrive. But like many of his communications, the promise was hollow. Washington made some attempts to break the Japanese blockade, offering private ship owners up to $10 million to ferry supplies. But no one was willing to risk it. Military planners calculated that any effective relief would require a massive force: at least 7 battleships, 5 aircraft carriers, 50 destroyers, 60 submarines, and 1,500 aircraft. As with their approach to the Holocaust, war planners determined that the most effective way to help the suffering was to shorten the war. So they chose to preserve their assets for the European campaign, saving them for the race to Berlin. Frustrated with this policy, MacArthur lashed out at Roosevelt, accusing him of mourning a distant cousin while allowing a daughter to be, quote, raped in the back room. In response, Roosevelt wrote 2 heartfelt letters, one to President Quezon of the Philippines, pledging that the United States would defend them to the death, and another to MacArthur, urging him to fight on for as long as humanly possible. 2 months later, Quezon was evacuated by submarine to establish a government in exile. Just 2 weeks after that, MacArthur was pulled from Corridor and sent to Australia, where he was named Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific. As he departed, he gave one final, now legendary message to the men he left behind: "Hold, for I will return." PBS, under the banner of The American Experience, interviewed 4 survivors of the siege of Bhutan, which lasted 3 grueling months. The soldiers began by recalling the overwhelming hunger that set in almost immediately upon arriving to the jungle. Food was so scarce that all the horses of the 26th Cavalry were slaughtered for meat. Even that wasn't enough. They hunted and ate monkeys, dogs, and cats in a desperate attempt to survive. The morale of the troops was further shaken when General MacArthur withdrew to Australia. Richard Gordon recalled, "The message from MacArthur was that help was on its way, and we were to hold fast. Planes would be coming, men would be coming, and what we needed would be there. Just hold tight. Do not, for 1 minute, think of giving up any ground." And at that point in time, we believed him totally, that help was on its way. But that help never came. Worn down by hunger, disease, and the absence of reinforcements, the defenders of Bhutan finally surrendered on April 6. The delay in surrender was due in part to the fact that the Japanese forces were suffering from the same issues. As Stanley Karnow explains, by the middle of February 1942, Bhutan was in deadlock. Hama, the Japanese general, far behind schedule, was distraught. Weeks earlier, reassured by his early successes, the high command in Tokyo had reassigned his best troops to Malaya and replaced them with aging veterans, trained more for occupation duties than jungle combat. Absolutely unfit for combat duty, as one of his staff described them, they were no better prepared for the jungle than the Americans. Their ranks also dwindled from hunger and disease. and Hama revealed the U.S. forces could have walked through them without encountering much resistance. Unlike MacArthur, Hama eventually did receive reinforcements, but the fact that he had to ask for them was seen as a humiliation, a public confession of failure, and a loss of face that ultimately led to his early retirement. Karnow is quick to point out, though, that Hama had overstated his problems. Despite having a numerical advantage, the American and Filipino defenders were simply too physically broken to mount a counterattack. The battle for Bhutan, Karnow writes, was a seesaw series of attacks interrupted by lulls as both sides collapsed from exhaustion. By the time of the surrender, the defenders had only 2 weeks' worth of food left. Nearly every man was stricken with malaria, and 3 out of every 4 had dysentery. Karnow describes the final Japanese assault as a torrent. Into the inferno of strangling smoke and dust poured wave after wave of enemy troops, shattering the defense lines and destroying leadership, discipline, order. Sick, starved, dazed, terrified men abandoned arms and equipment and milled about aimlessly, many so tired they fell asleep as soon as they sat down. That they had lasted as long as they did was a testament to their endurance. The sentiment was captured by war correspondent Frank Hewlett in a now famous limerick. "We're the battling bastards of Bhutan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn." It was likely a fitting expression of what many of the 70,000 who surrendered felt, still clinging to hope that the reinforcements would come and that their savior, Douglas MacArthur, would return. It's hard to imagine that the citizens of Japan today are descendants of the men and women who fought and died for the emperor during World War II. A peaceful and tolerant people now, the Japanese committed some of the worst war crimes under the sway of the emperor, who had rallied them to a brutal die for the emperor campaign. The organization Pacific Atrocities Education notes that with Japan's rise to cultural relevance, much of its war crimes during World War II have been greatly overshadowed, leading many people around the globe to forget these atrocities. From anime and manga to Sanrio and Nintendo, the former imperial nation has successfully rebranded itself as a soft power within a socio-political lens. As first popularized by American political scientist Joseph Nye, soft power is a diplomatic strategy used to make people in other countries more receptive to Japanese positions through the dissemination of the nation's culture and values. The Japanese began to employ this strategy in the 1980s to enhance their image. While Japan has actively worked to erase its violent history through cultural appeal and attraction, victims of their war crimes have continuously fought to ensure that this history is remembered and that the Japanese government is held accountable for their actions. One of the most horrific atrocities committed in the Philippines was the Bhutan Death March, a brutal 65-mile forced march of the prisoners entirely devoid of food, water, or rest. Around 70,000 soldiers surrendered to the Japanese, approximately 14,000 Americans, and the rest Filipino. 1 out of every 6 soldiers died along the way. Lester Tenney, a survivor, explained, "It was called the Death March because of the way they killed you. If you stopped walking, you died. If you had to defecate, you died. If you had a malaria attack, you died. It made no difference what it was. Either they cut your head off, shot you, or bayoneted you. But you died if you fell down." According to the Smithsonian Magazine, by the time the men reached Camp O'Donnell, at least 11,000 of the 70,000 had died along the way. Conditions in the camp were primitive. There were little sanitation, shelter, or fresh water. Only one spigot worked. During the first 3 months, some 1,500 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos died of dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition. Camp O'Donnell was an absolutely horrific place, says historian Hampton Sides. American soldiers had not experienced conditions so wretched since Andersonville prison camp during the Civil War. Of O'Donnell, one prisoner wrote, "Hell is only a state of mind. O'Donnell was a place." The soldiers renamed the camp Camp O'Death, designating its lone hospital as Zero Ward, as it left its patients with zero hope. The Atomic Heritage Foundation notes that escaping from the prison might have seemed like an option, since the fence was made of just a couple strands of barbed wire. However, the nearest safe zone was 9,000 miles away in Australia. The prisoners did not speak the local language, and any white captive's skin was a prison uniform he could not take off. Even if one managed to escape, the consequences were severe. Failure to appear on the next roll call meant that 9 other men would be killed in your place, as prisoners had been grouped into tens to discourage escape attempts. Yet in these darkest moments, the human spirit shone most brightly. Filipino locals risked their own lives to sneak food and water to prisoners along the death march and inside Camp O'Donnell. The Japanese sought to crush this aid, regularly torturing and beheading locals and placing their heads along the pathways as grisly warnings. Corregidor was the next to fall, with Japanese artillery pounding relentlessly from the now secured heights of Bhutan and launching suicidal waves of artillery carriers towards the established points of defense. The assault proved overwhelming. The American commander in charge sent a message to Roosevelt, writing with a broken heart and head bowed in sadness but not in shame, that he was surrendering to end the useless effusion of blood and human sacrifice. Following the fall of yet another American defensive position, guerrilla warfare erupted across the islands. Many Filipinos recall that witnessing so many Americans dying for their cause was what ultimately tipped them to the Allied side. This was despite a new government forming in Manila that collaborated with the Japanese occupiers. Had the new overlords aimed to improve the lives of the locals, perhaps they might have won support. But that was never Japanese interest. As Karnow explains, Filipinos rapidly learned that co-prosperity meant servitude to Japan's economic requirements. The Japanese had no use for Philippine sugar, but desperately needed cotton. They launched a program to go cotton instead of sugar, with ruinous results that impoverished the 10% of the population involved in the sugar industry. As scarcity drove prices through the roof, famine spread. To make matters worse, the Japanese sent the remaining gold and dollar reserves of the country to Tokyo to enrich Japan, thereby depriving the Philippine currency of its backing. As a substitute, they printed billions of worthless pesos that Filipinos, familiar with Hollywood slang, derisively dubbed Mickey Mouse money. Society spiraled into chaos under the collaborating government, with black markets springing up across the islands and prostitution flourishing. Filipino writer Carmen Necpil Guerrero described the desperate survival tactics. Only survival mattered. Pious old ladies lived on what their cooks looted from their neighborhood grocer. Brothers hid little bags of sugar or lard from each other. Fathers ate their ill-gotten slice of pork while their children languished on a vegetable diet. Filipinos now resorted to savage and ardent cunning, plain deceit, pimping, hoarding, and furnishing the enemy with war material, becoming callous and miserly, a race of spies, thieves, saboteurs, informers, Karnow adds. The endemic venality and corruption that nags the Philippines today is largely a legacy of the ethical degradation of that period. Despite the hardships, resistance persisted, motivated variously by hopes of restoring American rule, achieving true independence, or even launching a Mao Zedong-style communist revolution. As a result, the conquest of the Philippines was the only Japanese conquest in the Pacific that failed to proceed according to their timetable. In May of 1942, the tide of the Pacific War finally turned in favor of the Americans. The Battle of Midway reopened critical sea lanes around the archipelago, and by early 1944, the Japanese appeared to be in full retreat. Meanwhile, MacArthur, still safely stationed in Australia, caught wind of a plan to bypass the Philippines in favor of striking directly at Taiwan, using it as a base for future assaults on Japan. MacArthur argued so vehemently against this strategy that President Roosevelt agreed to meet with him personally in Hawaii. The affable general won the president over, promising quick and dramatic results. The Japanese found defending the Philippines as difficult as the Americans had, and just after midnight on October 19, 1944, Douglas MacArthur set foot not far from the site where Magellan had once erected his cross. One of his first acts was to broadcast a radio message. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. Rally to me. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory." A decisive naval battle soon followed at Leyte Gulf. Despite the two forces being evenly matched, the Americans won a resounding victory that cost the Japanese half of their naval tonnage. A Japanese admiral later admitted the defeat was tantamount to the loss of the Philippines. Historian Robert Farley goes further, calling the battle the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a major fighting force, and noting it secured an Allied foothold in the Philippines, setting the stage for Japan's eventual defeat in World War II. Once ashore, the fighting previewed what was to come later in Okinawa, as the two sides battled fiercely for 10 days. Although the combat continued, MacArthur, ever the showman, declared victory prematurely to better fit his previously announced timeline. A month later, he arrived in Manila, just in time to witness yet another Japanese war crime. Rather than proclaiming Manila an open city as MacArthur had hoped, the Japanese prepared for a brutal defense. Their ships were bombarded from above by kamikaze pilots, marking only the beginning of the destruction. Karnow writes, "As the Americans entered Manila from the north, the Japanese rear admiral unleashed an urban variation of the scorched earth policy, burning docks, warehouses, and other port installations. The flames, fanned by the wind, quickly swept across the city's slums, igniting flimsy shacks and panicking thousands. Trapped in the chaos, the Japanese embarked on an orgy of atrocities matched only by the pillage of Nanking in 1937. They impaled babies on bayonets, raped women, beheaded men, and mutilated corpses. They set houses ablaze, shot fleeing inhabitants, and started fires in hospitals after strapping patients to their beds. But the majority of civilian deaths were caused by the fierce exchanges of American and Japanese artillery fire. By mid-February, as they tightened the noose around Manila, American forces faced the grim task of rooting out the deeply entrenched Japanese defenders. Wary of using air power in the densely populated city, MacArthur condemned his troops to cruel, remorseless, and treacherous urban combat, fighting the kind of warfare even seasoned soldiers detest. Their struggle raged for weeks, with battles fought street by street, house by house, room by room, often hand to hand. Brutality was committed on both sides. One American veteran described a room after his team hit it with a flamethrower, claiming the heat had glued the Japs to the wall. Literally, they looked like wallpaper. The resistance was so fierce that the battle earned the grim nickname the Stalingrad of Asia. The Hoover Institute records that by March 3rd, Manila, or what was left of it, had been liberated, but the battle destroyed much of the city. Amid the ruins lay the bodies of 17,000 Japanese soldiers, nearly the entire garrison, along with 100,000 Filipinos, victims of American firepower and Japanese atrocities. To complete his "I have returned" message, MacArthur led his men to retake Corregidor. Instead of surrendering, the Japanese detonated their remaining underground arsenal, killing 2,000 of their own in exchange for many American lives. But when the smoke cleared, MacArthur remained. The last of the Japanese forces, save for a few famous holdouts, surrendered a month later, after a plane flew overhead with the message, "Japan has ordered peace to be negotiated with the Allied nations." 10 days earlier, the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima had been leveled by atomic bombs. As expected, Douglas MacArthur personally accepted the formal surrender of the Japanese-led government of the Philippines. The shared sacrifice in the face of repeated Japanese atrocities forged a closer bond between the Filipino and American peoples. Meanwhile, Europe's post-war actions helped restore America's reputation as the benevolent empire. Colonial powers rushed back into Southeast Asia to reclaim their lost empires. France's reassertion of power over Vietnam, or French Indochina, was a reminder of their weakened state, desperately trying to restart their economy. Many Filipinos breathed a sigh of relief when the United States reaffirmed its commitment to grant the Philippines independence on July 4, 1946. Upon hearing this, Ho Chi Minh, the communist freedom fighter of Vietnam, ironically remarked to the U.S. liaison officer working with him, "If the Americans had been our masters, they would now be giving us our freedom." MacArthur, placed in charge of the entire Pacific theater, had become bogged down in the Philippines, missing the invasion of Okinawa as well as key strategy sessions deciding whether to use atomic bombs. Nevertheless, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, he headed to Japan to oversee the military occupation. His appointment was partly political, as he harbored presidential ambitions. Still, he was widely regarded as the best man for the job, given the monumental task of transforming Japan from an aggressive imperial power into the economic juggernaut that it is today. Despite his new role, MacArthur regularly involved himself in Philippine affairs, furthering his own personality cult that endures to this day. Not everyone in the Philippines supported immediate independence. Many feared the islands lacked the resources to rebuild without official U.S. obligations. After his glorious return, MacArthur frequently undermined the sitting president, ultimately endorsing right-wing politician Manuel Rojas, despite Rojas' prior collaboration with the Japanese. He won MacArthur over with flattery, calling him one of the greatest soldiers of all time. Writing the slogan, "If he's good enough for MacArthur, he's good enough for me," Rojas' party swept both chambers of Congress. The civilian leader of the American delegation in the Philippines warned that enemy collaborators now dominated the legislature. But Washington, fearful of left-wing socialists, ignored the caution. Though later purged by political rivals, Rojas guided the Philippines through its toughest post-war Reconstruction years. He negotiated reduced U.S. demands for military bases, secured economic aid, and reshaped trade relations. These decisions deepened the Philippines' economic and strategic dependence on the United States, a relationship that would endure for decades. Rojas also set other precedents. Filipino leaders would come to be expected to be corrupt, face assassination attempts, and yield to U.S. pressure. Yet that dynamic began to shift at the turn of the century, with the election of Rodrigo Duterte, a leader who disregarded precedent, protocol, and principles. We'll explore his presidency in our fifth and final episode of this series. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit helps keep this show going and is much appreciated. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.